Dune 1984 had no CGI, no digital effects. Everything you saw on screen was built by hand, filmed in camera, and extremely dangerous.
It's a challenge and it's a risk.
The crew breathed toxic glass particles that destroyed lungs. They wore clothing stripped from real corpses, and they operated sandworms so massive they needed underground teams to control them. This was before safety regulations meant anything. These are 16 insane facts about the deadliest production in science fiction history. The wrong director. You might assume David Lynch was a science fiction expert hired specifically for his vision of Frank Herbert's novel.
It was a year and a half working on the script.
The truth is far stranger. When producer Dino De Laurentiis contacted Lynch in 1979, the director had never heard of Dune. He had never read the book. He knew absolutely nothing about the source material or how to make a science fiction film at all. De Laurentiis simply liked The Elephant Man and wanted Lynch for the spectacle. Even more shocking, Lynch had other offers on the table. George Lucas personally approached him to direct Return of the Jedi.
What George loves makes hundreds of billions of dollars,
offering him the chance to complete the original Star Wars trilogy. Lynch turned it down. He told Lucas directly that Star Wars was his thing, not Lynch's thing, and walked away from guaranteed success. Instead, he chose Dune.
I know no way I can do this. He said, David, calm down. You don't have to do this.
A project he knew nothing about. Lynch later admitted this was a catastrophic mistake. He spent 6 months working on script drafts with writer Eric Berggren before they divorced over creative differences. Lynch then wrote 5 more drafts completely alone, teaching himself the Dune universe page by page. Ridley Scott's Ghost. Before Lynch ever touched Dune, the project had already destroyed one legendary director. Ridley Scott was originally hired by De Laurentiis in 1979 after securing the rights to Herbert's novel in 1976. Scott spent 7 months developing the project with writer Randy Wurlitzer and set designer H.R. Geiger, the same artist who created the xenomorph for Alien. Scott's plan was ambitious. He wanted to split Dune into 2 separate feature films to properly capture the scope of the story. Production designs were created, scripts were drafted, sets were conceptualized. Then Scott's older brother died unexpectedly. Devastated by the loss, Scott abandoned Dune completely to make Blade Runner instead. He cited the death as his primary reason, but also mentioned how slow and time-consuming Dune would have been. In a twist of fate decades later, both Dune and Blade Runner would be remade by the same director, Denis Villeneuve, proving the universe has a dark sense of humor. The Jodorowsky legend. Even before Ridley Scott, there was an even more insane version of Dune that almost happened. In 1974, Chilean filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky secured the book rights and assembled the most ambitious cast and crew in cinema history. His plan was to create a 10 to 14-hour epic that would change movies forever. For the script, he hired Alien writer Dan O'Bannon. For visual effects, he recruited H.R. Geiger, years before Alien existed. For costume and world design, he brought in legendary artist Mobius. For the soundtrack, he approached Pink Floyd. The casting choices were even more unbelievable. Jodorowsky wanted Salvador Dali to play the Emperor. He pursued Orson Welles for Baron Harkonnen. He tried to cast Mick Jagger as Fade Routha. 15. Giant sandworms. The sandworms in Dune are the most iconic creatures in science fiction literature. Bringing them to life in 1984 required building 15 separate rubber models at different scales, depending on which miniature sets they would be used on. The largest sandworms were 22 feet long and 3 feet in diameter. Each one was first sculpted in clay, then molded in plaster. A latex rubber skin was cast and packed with polyurethane foam to create the body. The larger versions were engineered with mechanical mouths that could open to reveal rows of crystalline teeth. Their heads could lift up and move from side to side. The medium-sized worms could gyrate and twist, but their mouths were fixed closed. The smallest models were used purely for background shots. Operating these creatures required teams of handlers called worm wranglers who worked underground, buried beneath miniature sand dunes. The sand that destroyed lungs. Creating realistic sand at miniature scale presented a massive technical problem. Regular sand is too coarse and heavy. It looks wrong on camera when filmed at high speed. The special effects team needed something that would flow like real desert sand, but work at model scale. Their solution was microballoons, microscopic hollow glass spheres, used in industrial applications. These tiny glass particles moved perfectly on camera. They created realistic dunes and dust clouds. They looked exactly like the surface of an alien desert planet. There was just one problem. Microballoons are hyper-dangerous to breathe. When disturbed, they become airborne and can permanently damage lung tissue. These particles are so small, they bypass normal respiratory defenses and lodge deep in the lungs. Costumes from corpses. One of the most visually striking elements of Dune is the sleek black bodysuits worn by members of the Spacing Guild. They look alien, industrial, and perfectly suited to the film's strange aesthetic. But these costumes were not designed or created for the movie. The costume department discovered them in an abandoned firehouse in San Diego. They were real body bags from the 1920s. The bags had been used for decades to transport actual human corpses before being discarded and forgotten. The production team found them, cleaned them, and painted them with tar to create the distinctive, glossy black appearance. The webbed canvas material and integrated straps made them perfect for the Guild's utilitarian look.
Running around and fighting battles and sweating in them. I think down in Mexico they would call them the death suits.
But here's the truly disturbing part. The costume department did not inform the actors wearing these suits about their origin. The performers had no idea they were dressed in genuine corpse containers. They only learned the truth after filming wrapped and production had moved on. Patrick Stewart's mistaken identity. Patrick Stewart's casting as Gurney Halleck is one of the most celebrated elements of Dune 1984. However, his presence in the film was a complete accident. The role was originally given to actor Aldo Ray, but Ray was forced to drop out at the last minute due to severe alcoholism that made him unable to work. David Lynch needed an immediate replacement. In the rush to fill the role, Lynch thought he was hiring a different actor also named Patrick Stewart. The confusion wasn't discovered until Stewart actually arrived on set in Mexico. By that point, production was so far behind schedule that Lynch couldn't afford to recast. Stewart stayed in the role and delivered one of the film's most memorable performances. But the chaos didn't end there. Sting's reluctant deal. When audiences saw rock star Sting appear on screen as the sadistic Feyd-Rautha, they assumed he jumped at the chance for movie stardom. The reality was the opposite. Sting did not want to be in Dune at all. In a Rolling Stone interview, he admitted the truth. He only agreed to the role because David Lynch was directing. He respected Lynch's work and couldn't say no to him personally. But Sting believed starring in an enormous Hollywood production would actually damage his acting career. He wanted to build slowly with smaller independent projects. Instead, he found himself contractually obligated to a massive studio film he had no faith in. The massive Mexican operation. The scale of Dune's production was unlike anything attempted before in Mexico. To cut costs while maintaining creative control, the entire film was shot at Churubusco Studios in Mexico City and surrounding locations. The operation required approximately 1,700 crew members working simultaneously. The production constructed 75 to 80 individual sets built across 16 different sound stages. Some sets were so enormous they couldn't fit inside the studio buildings. These had to be constructed outside on studio grounds, or in borrowed spaces like the Aztec Stadium parking lot. The Harkonnen spaceship landing pad set, for example, was built entirely outdoors because no interior space was large enough to contain it. The studio had to create additional rooms, specifically to house factories and production offices. Mexico's production. Hell filming in Mexico saved money but created catastrophic problems that nearly shut down production permanently. The crew faced Mexico's Byzantine government bureaucracy at every turn. Permits that should have taken days required weeks. Equipment shipments were held at customs indefinitely. The production dealt with rolling blackouts that hit multiple times per week, forcing them to install and maintain backup generators that ran constantly. The studio had access to exactly one functioning phone line for the entire 1,700-person operation. Communication with the outside world was nearly impossible. The Mexico City smog was worse than Los Angeles, creating hazy air that ruined outdoor shots and made breathing difficult. Then came the cockroach infestations. The creatures invaded sets, equipment cases, and living quarters. But the worst disaster was Montezuma's revenge. Dozens of crew members contracted severe food poisoning and diarrhea simultaneously. Analog effects. Revolution every single visual effect in Dune 1984 was created using practical, in-camera techniques. There was no computer-generated imagery because it didn't exist yet in any usable form. The energy shields that protect characters were created using rotoscoping, a technique where animators hand-draw effects frame by frame over live-action footage. The explosive destruction of vehicles was filmed using miniature models and real pyrotechnics captured at high speed. Matte paintings were created by artists using physical paint on glass panels positioned in front of the camera. The blue screen composites were filmed outdoors using natural sunlight, a nearly impossible technique because sunlight contains so much red light that it contaminates the blue channel and ruins the effect. Children as special effects. The space jockey scene in Alien used children to make sets look bigger. David Lynch borrowed the exact same trick for Dune. When the crew discovers the giant fossilized alien pilot and massive navigation chamber, the set they built still wasn't large enough to sell the proper sense of scale. Lynch needed the human characters to look like insects compared to the alien technology. Since the production couldn't afford to build even larger sets, Lynch recruited his own sons, Jake and Luke, along with several children of crew members. The costume department created scaled-down versions of the spacesuits in children's sizes. These kids were dressed in the miniature costumes and filmed walking through the sets. The 4-hour cut. That never was. The legend of David Lynch's 4-hour director's cut has haunted Dune fans for decades. The truth is more complicated and disappointing. Lynch's original rough cut, assembled from all raw footage without any post-production effects, did run over 4 hours long. This version was shown to the crew in Mexico and to Frank Herbert himself. However, this was never Lynch's intended final cut. It was simply all the footage they shot. Lynch's actual planned version, as reflected in his 7th and final script draft, was nearly 3 hours long. But Universal Studios and the film's financiers expected a standard 2-hour theatrical release. They forced Lynch, Dino De Laurentiis, and producer Raffaella De Laurentiis to excise numerous scenes. New footage was filmed that simplified plot elements. Voiceover narration was added. The Alan Smithee version. The theatrical cut that audiences saw in December 1984 was bad enough. But 3 years later, a television version was prepared for broadcast that completely destroyed Lynch's vision. This TV cut ran 186 minutes, significantly longer than the theatrical release. It replaced Virginia Madsen's opening monologue with a much longer introduction using concept art stills. It included numerous deleted scenes and extended sequences. And it padded the runtime with repeated footage to fill the 3-hour broadcast window. When Lynch saw what had been done to his film, he was so disgusted that he exercised his contractual right to remove his name from the credits entirely. The most uncomfortable costume ever. Patrick Stewart has worn countless costumes throughout his legendary career. Shakespearean period pieces, Star Trek uniforms, X-Men tactical gear, elaborate stage productions. But according to Stewart himself, The still suit he wore in Dune remains the most physically uncomfortable costume he has ever experienced. The suits were designed to look like they recycled the body's moisture in the desert environment. This meant they were intentionally form-fitting, restrictive, and made from materials that didn't breathe. The suits trapped heat, they chafed, they limited movement, and actors had to wear them for hours on end in the Mexican heat under studio lights. Stewart has said the still suit torture was one of the few genuinely miserable aspects of the production. Hollywood's $40 million disaster Dune cost approximately $40 million to produce in 1984. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $120 million in today's money. It was one of the most expensive films ever made at the time, costing more than any of the first 3 Star Wars films and 4 times more than E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Universal Studios expected a massive return. They launched extensive publicity campaigns. They released the film in December, prime blockbuster season. The result was catastrophic. Dune earned only $30 million domestically. It failed to recoup its production budget, let alone cover marketing costs and distribution. Critics savaged the film. Roger Ebert called it a real mess. The New York Times said it was perilously overloaded. Variety called it huge, hollow, and cold. They built 15 sandworms by hand. They breathed toxic glass particles. They wore corpse containers without knowing it. And they created one of the most visually stunning failures in Hollywood history. Dune 1984 killed careers, destroyed budgets, and proved that practical effects were as deadly as they were beautiful. If you want more cinema disasters, hit subscribe for deep dives into filmmaking chaos.